Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast. That is, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back again. I'm Paul Gigot with Kate Odell and Joe Sternberg. Let's talk about an event that happened last week, which could be an important moment in the American defense debate. For one of the things that the Ukraine war has exposed is the inadequacy of the American industrial defense base. It's clear that we have struggled now to maintain even the basic munitions that are needed to supply Ukraine and supply the U.S. And now a member of Congress, Roger Wicker of Mississippi, senator, he's the ranking Republican on the Armed Services Committee, and he would become chairman if Republicans take control of the Senate in November, as many people expect. So it's significant that he has put forth a report in which he calls for the United States to increase its defense budget from a little above 3% of GDP, as it is now, to 5%, which would be a very significant increase, about $55 billion as a ramp up here for the Pentagon in 2025, and then continuing to move up. This is a sharp contrast to President Biden's budgets, which have proposed to cut defense in real terms for 4 years running. Now, Congress has countered that to some extent, but nothing close to the extent that Roger Wicker is now proposing. And Kate, why don't you elaborate a little bit on what he is saying?
Well, I think this is an important marker in the discussion, and I think it's the start of a conversation of trying to explain to the American public that though they hear a lot that we spend a lot on defense, that actually at 3% of GDP, we are at historic lows. I mean, we were at 4.5% even in the early 2010s. So the trend line is downward. But what that means in practice, I think what the public service has done is go through detailing just what some of the vulnerabilities in our military are. And it is an alarming combination of both a conventional force that has been shrinking pretty dramatically as Reagan-era equipment wears out. We have not done a large military recapitalization since the Reagan years in the 1980s, still living off a lot of the same systems that we built during those times. So we have a bow wave of retirements in both ships and aircraft that aren't being replaced in sufficient number. At the same time, the nuclear triad is going over a generational overhaul. For instance, new Columbia-class submarines taking over older ballistic missile submarines, a brand new bomber in the works for the Air Force on the air leg. I mean, these are enormous priorities that can't just be sustained on a baseline budget if the U.S. wants to fix those vulnerabilities. And pair that, too, with just some basic other problems that one you described, which is that our munition stocks are not as deep as they should be if we are going to be able to help Ukraine and Taiwan and Israel at once, let alone fight a high-intensity war ourselves where you could consume thousands of missiles a day. And there's just really practical stuff that, for instance, as the threat environment changes, we probably need more troops rotating through NATO's Eastern Front. Our Pacific posture is not hardened for any kind of conflict. We just station huge amounts of troops in a couple big places. They're turkeys. All these problems I'm describing cannot be fixed on the cheap or quickly or just by reforming waste, fraud, and abuse. So I think he's done a really important task here by starting a conversation with the public. These are the problems. We're either going to fix them or we're going to risk what happens if we don't, which it's potentially losing a conflict that we're not prepared for.
The Wicker report appears at a time when our adversaries are working together in much more concerted fashion. China's helping Russia with its economy in Ukraine. Russia, in turn, has been helping China with patrols in the Pacific. You have Iran and North Korea supplying Russia. Russia then helping break sanctions for both of these countries that it once supported in the United Nations. So the coordination among these adversaries, even as they ramp up their military spending in extraordinary fashion, is what Rick Wicker is responding to. There's a lot of Americans, Joe, who would say, though, oh, well, there they go again, the hawks. They just want to spend more money. on defense, even though we spend more than the rest of the world, not combined, but pretty substantially. And we don't need it. And by the way, the fiscal deficit is enormous, as it is. The federal debt is enormous, and they're right about that. But what's your response to people who say we can't afford a defense increase?
I mean, can we afford to live in a world where we don't? I mean, you've pointed out that, America's adversaries are finding ways to cooperate with each other to become much more menacing in multiple regions at the same time. I mean, remember, at the same time we're talking about Ukraine, we're worried about potential developments in Asia. There are big implications for American values and also, frankly, for the American way of life. I mean, the economic implications of these conflicts starting to spiral out of control are pretty severe. I don't think that Americans want to live in a world where we are not effectively balancing these threats. That's a very dangerous world. That's a world where we can't enjoy the kind of prosperity and security that we have grown accustomed to since the end of the Cold War. So, if you compare it to that alternative, increased defense spending is cheap at whatever cost we're going to pay for it.
I guess, Kate, the question is anybody going to listen to Mr. Wicker starting this year?
Well, I think it would be a good campaign theme for Trump. He's having a hard time, I think, articulating exactly what he wants to do with a second term beyond some of these retributions for how he's been treated by Democrats. So I think it could be a potent theme if you were to get interested in. But I also think, there is a spending conversation in Congress about next year's funding bills. And you do have a number of members who are interested in revisiting the 2-year spending deal that Kevin McCarthy, when he was Speaker, negotiated with President Biden, and looking at those caps because they hold defense to a less than 1% increase. A real cut in defense is what is planned right now if Congress does not do anything. So I think there is some political interest in listening to this conversation Wicker has started. And I think also that it helps to have proposed some really significant things that need to be done. I'll give you just one last example. I mean, if you remember the Chinese spy balloon episode, it really revealed that our homeland radars are not well tuned to tracking these low-level threats. That is a problem. So that's an example of something Wicker proposes where we need to invest more in 2025 for Northcom to improve its radars for homeland defense. So this is an example of the kind of concrete things that I think are helpful to the public, and they can understand, we're not just throwing, like we're describing, more defense money into a black hole. We're patching up some real vulnerabilities. So I do think there's a chance that this starts a productive conversation in Congress that influences the spending bills later this year.
Yeah, I would hope so, but I suspect that we're going to kick this real hard budget decisions into 2025. Probably. That's typically what happens here close to an election year. They'll have another continuing resolution of a kind rather than real appropriations. Though the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, has said he wants to pass appropriations. We'll see if that turns out to be the case. The puzzle for me is that Donald Trump has not grabbed on this, and I wonder why, because, of course, he has boasted about his defense spending increases when he was president. They turned out to be helpful, but hardly a major increase of the kind that I think the present moment demands. And given Joe Biden's 4 budgets in a row of real cuts, Trump could make this an issue, and given that the world is in so much turmoil. But I think he might also be worried about criticism from the likes of Rand Paul, the senator from Kentucky, who doesn't want to spend more on defense at all. In fact, wants to cut the defense budget. And Rand Paul has not endorsed Trump yet. So that may be something he is thinking about. On the other hand, Trump hasn't told us much at all about what he's going to do with his next term if he wins. All right, we're going to end it there. Thank you all for listening. Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Joe. And remember, we're here every day on Potomac Watch, and we hope you'll be with us as well. Thanks for listening.